I'm Denise, I'm the Scottish one.
And she's a non-fiction editor. And I'm Louise, the English one.
And she's a fiction editor. And together,
we're the Editing Podcast.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Editing Podcast. Today we're talking about grammar, pedantry and peevery. And we're delighted to welcome our special guest, Rob Drummond. So Rob's a reader in linguistics at Manchester Metropolitan University, head of youth language for the Manchester Centre for Youth Studies, and he's written books with Cambridge University Press, Palgrave Macmillan on world Englishes and urban youth language.
Welcome, Rob. Yes.
Yes, thank you.
So, Rob, we met you at the 2019 Society for Editors and Proofreaders annual conference, which was at Aston in Birmingham, and you were our speaker at the gala dinner. That's when you got us thinking and laughing about grammar and pedantry and peevery, and we were really delighted when you agreed to come on our podcast and have a chat about this, especially some of the so-called rules that surround language from a linguistic point of view. So welcome to the podcast and thanks for joining us.
Thanks for inviting me.
So Rob, I think the first thing we wanted to have a look at was the fact that writers hire editors like us, like me and Denise, for lots of reasons: smoothing the flow of text, checking for tension and drama, bringing clarity to a fictional scene or an academic argument. But one thing that a lot of people think of when the word editor comes up is grammar checking. They want us to ensure that the grammar's correct, and I say that putting some inverted commas around
air
it.
Quotes up there.
Yeah, my air quotes. And that's a problem because sometimes that line between correct and preferred or contextually relevant is really blurred, isn't it? And so can you tell us how you as a linguist view the distinction and whether this is more an issue of pedantry or peevery?
Yeah, it is very blurred, and I think the idea of something being contextually relevant is the best term to use. Because if we're going to use the term correct, then it has to be correct within a particular context. So I guess some things can be correct. You can talk about spellings being correct or incorrect, or there might be a wrong word that has been used, and that's obviously a mistake. But then, to be fair, even then you've got to be a little bit careful, because certain words that people they might not be standard words, but they still have sort of meaning. And I mean, a big thing, if you think about the word, the word irregardless.
Yes.
You see, there's a little.
You've already made loads of people switch off.
Exactly. So it's that. So when you start having that question, well, you come across this word and people say, well, that's not a word, and you say, well, if it's not a word, what is it exactly? If I'm using this word in a way that the person I'm talking to or communicating with or writing to understands it, then arguably it's a word. And but the important thing is it's not appropriate in certain contexts. So it's not relevant in particular contexts. I can see that.
Yeah. It's that's one of those words that, like you say, it's performing a function, and we understand what somebody means when they use it. It's just that a lot of people don't like it, do they?
No, exactly, and I can see why. But it's this kind of really rigid thing that's not a word, and that's not, and because then of course you're just abiding by these rules of so-called standard English, which to be fair is the appropriate context in a lot of situations. And in standard English there are kind of regular and accepted conventions, and so it is easy to see how this becomes seen as somehow better, but of course it's not. So
it's
the word irregardless
thing, isn't it?
Exactly. And it's the word irregardless, I mean, that's a really, I actually personally wouldn't use the word irregardless, but I think when people get so cross about it because it's say, well, it's not a word and it's wrong, and I'd question that sort of argument. It might well be not appropriate for a given context, because that context might require the rules and conventions of standard English. But to kind of blanket say, well, that's not a word, and
I think you nailed it there when you said it's not about it being better. The fact that standard English has chosen the term regardless. If back in the day it had been standard to use the word irregardless, then we'd be having a different discussion. And so this notion of what's better that often comes up into these conversations is problematic, isn't it? It's about standard rather than best.
It is. Exactly. And the standard, as we know, is pretty much came from a sort of arbitrary, has a sort of pretty arbitrary history of just being the variety that was used in a particular area of the country when people started trying to write these things down.
Oh.
So and then of course it just is a kind of a circle of it just gets given this prestige. So those forms are seen as better in some way, but we know that language changes so much over time anyway. So then then the other argument you'll get into with people who insist on using the word decimate, in a particular way.
Yeah.
And to me, that's such a blinkered way of looking at language, because you can't follow those rules on the one hand and then ignore other rules. I don't know words like, was it silly, or words that had completely different meanings.
Yeah, like nice. That's another one, isn't
exactly.
it?
Yeah, we don't use those words anymore. But why are you insisting on this particular one?
Yeah.
And well, the fact is, we know why it is. It's because people are very, very happy with the idea that language changes, but they don't like to think of it changing within their own lifetime. And so, the version of English they think is the best is the one that they acquired themselves, and anything that deviates from that is wrong.
They kind of remain frozen in time with what they were taught at school and that sort of thing. Yeah. So, Rob, our listeners are dealing with the written word, and there are, obviously, as we've been saying, there are certain so-called rules that get people in a bit of a tiz, and it tends to bring the peevers out in force. Louise and I both have blogs, and we've both experienced the delight of receiving unsolicited comments about splitting infinitives or starting sentences with a conjunction. Do you think that which zombie rules of language do you think we should really get rid of as soon as possible, and why? Are there any that score really highly on your list?
Yeah, for me, it's starting a sentence with a conjunction, I think is a big one. I think that's a crazy kind of piece of advice that doesn't make much sense. For me, it's also the kind of the less and fewer rule.
Right.
Oh yeah, that's a good one.
Because the thing with a lot of these so-called rules is that the kind of archetypal, there are examples that are given in textbooks and they make a lot of sense. And so we use less with this, and we use fewer with countable nouns and less with uncountable nouns, and that's fine. And the example they'll give will be, fewer apples. We don't say less apples, but less milk, or something really clear.
Yeah.
But then the problem is when you start to get to those areas which aren't so clear, and people then still stick kind of doggedly to what they think is correct. So you start talking about, you might hear someone talk about, like, there's that's one fewer person to worry about, or I slept for fewer than 7 hours, and because they got it in their heads that no, we can count it. I can count people, so it must be fewer. I can count hours, it must be fewer. And of course, it doesn't work like that, and there are conventions within that, so we can people who work with grammar can explain why those two sentences aren't correct. But of course, for most people who just have a vague understanding that there's some rule, and so I think it's things like that really need to be
that brings to mind the distinction between over and more than as well, which I still don't even really get what the distinction is.
I know.
It's just...
But I do know that there are editors out there who will absolutely make that distinction.
Even on social media.
Yeah.
Oh, don't get me started. We see that's where that's a crazy. The other one actually, which is more in my area of work in terms of dealing with academic writing, dealing with students and their academic writing, is somebody has told them at some point that they shouldn't use I, that they shouldn't make it, and this drives me mad, because the ways in which they try and get round using I, once they start talking about the author referring to themselves, or the researcher, or using so much kind of passive constructions just to avoid saying I, when so somebody has made this rule, and we don't stick by it. I realize it might be discipline specific, to be honest. I can see that, but within linguistics, social sciences, humanities, there is nothing wrong with using I. It's to try and distance yourself, kind of really kind of turning somersaults to try and to try and
We
distance yourself
we
from.
see this all the time in we're in various sort of Facebook groups for editors, but also I can think of one Facebook group we're in, which is where writers can ask editors questions, and the variety of rules that they ask about is incredible. Things
Yeah.
that I've never heard of, or no one's ever heard of, but they're tying themselves in knots, trying to avoid doing something that someone has told them
And
is
that
wrong.
not thing is really interesting when it
Yeah.
comes to the other zombie rule about not ending a sentence with a preposition. And again, it's a bit like that thing you were talking about, Rob, where people end up constructing these really complex, unreadable sentences, unspeakable sentences that in order to avoid breaking this so-called rule that they, I don't know, someone told them was the right way to do it 57 million years ago or something, and it just makes no sense. And
Exactly.
it spoils the language. It takes it actually pulls the reader out of the point that's trying to be communicated.
It does, and those rules, those conventions were just made up, just by old white men sitting in a study, deciding, I think it should be this, and so they do that. It's
I think
very
also that other example you briefly touched on as well is, trying to avoid using the passive. Well, there is a place for the passive in writing, and this again, people really getting in knots, and I think it's important for listeners who are maybe trying to get to grips with writing to realize that the beauty of the language is that it's flexibility, and that we should be able to work with all these things without saying an absolute yes or no to anything, really.
And just to therefore reiterate the fact that we are speaking today to a linguist. So even if you don't trust your editor to question those zombie rules, then listen to someone who does this, who understands this stuff professionally.
Lives and breathes it,
Rob, you work with and carry out research on youth language. Do you think it's common that each generation has a tendency to view the next generation as destroying or dumbing down language? I mean, we've all been through that thing where I've heard that numerous times, like, oh, well, back in our day, we didn't say it like this. Is there an argument that dumbing down or destruction of language isn't what's happening at all, but that actually I'm kind of putting my answer or my view and Denise's view in your mouth, but it's sort of that contrasting that idea with an alternative that it's actually vibrant and creative and enriches our language.
Yes, it's exactly that. It is vibrant and it does enrich the language. And the idea that standards are slipping, with young people and language, it's just completely false. But what's interesting is, you can show evidence of this by the very fact that literally every generation has said this about the people younger themselves. And there's a great talk by the linguist John McWhirter. He did a TED talk called "Texting is Killing the Language."
Oh yeah.
And he gives really good examples because he shows he's explaining this about older people saying that texting is ruining English basically. And he has a quote from 1956 about some school teacher complaining about young people not being able to use grammar properly, showing how it's from that old. And then he has a similar quote from 1917 saying exactly the same thing. And then he has one from 1871, and then 1841, and then his last example is one from 63 AD.
Oh my goodness!
How young people aren't able to use Latin properly.
Yeah.
That's fantastic.
And I think anybody who works with young people, you just listen to them speaking, and you can see how vibrant this language is. And I did something recently. I was giving a talk about youth language to some people recently, and just to kind of update my own examples, I just asked Twitter if they had for people to give me any examples, for older people to give me any examples of words they'd heard young people use that they didn't really understand, and also for young people to give me examples of words they used that older people didn't understand. And so I had so many replies, most of which came from older people saying they don't understand these terms. And so we had things like salty, dank, leng, flex, stan, low-key, sweat, retweet, all these words, and but the interest, and then I put all this up on Twitter, and young people were amazed that people didn't know this, and when I was talking to loads of A-level students, and they were just kind of giggling about all these things. And so, but the thing is, old people, you can't have it both ways. You can't, on the one hand, say that language is kind of dumbing down and becoming less sophisticated. You can't say that on the one hand, but at the same time, look at this list of words and say, I have no idea what any of these mean. Those two things, it doesn't.
They're not the same, are they?
Yeah,
not
exactly.
Knowing a word is not saying that just because you don't know something doesn't mean that it's.
It doesn't invalidate it, does it?
No, exactly. To me, it just means the opposite. The fact that all these young people that have these really sophisticated ways of describing things that we don't have as older people, surely is an example of language being just as sophisticated, if not more sophisticated. And we know it changes. And the very fact that older people don't understand it, I think, is completely right and proper. I think young people should have their own way of speaking. And sure enough, as soon as adults start using these things, then
you took the words out of my mouth. I
was just thinking that too.
Because there's nothing.
Mum, that's so 2017.
Mum, you are not allowed to say that you stand something. That is just, I'm not allowed to say that. Yeah, they're so creative. I love this. I've got 3 kids that are all in or round about teens, and they are incredibly creative. And I notice even with my youngest is almost 13, my eldest is 21, even the language has changed between them. My 21-year-old used language that my 12-year-old, 13-year-old doesn't use anymore because it's moved on. So things move quickly.
Yeah. And so isn't that, and that's great. So that just shows how kind of vibrant the whole thing is.
And it also shows how those young people are able to shift their own boundaries and understandings and so much more quickly perhaps than I've ever been able to. I think that I look at the way I speak and the kind of things I learned, and maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm not so aware of it, but it does seem to happen so much faster these days that certain words go in and out of fashion. And I think it's amazing that they can learn it so quickly and discard it equally when it's no longer of use to them, but they always understand. And
they do, and of course, but they're using language so much more. So all of these, again, false arguments that kids don't communicate, and because they're always on their phones. But what are they doing on their phones? They're communicating all the time. You watch your teen, say I've got 3 teenagers as well, and just watching them on their phones, it's constant, and looking at the way they construct messages. It's not like old people do. It's not like, and imagine when we were at school, you talk to someone at school, you talk to people at school, lots of interaction there, and then you could come home and maybe you might be on the phone to someone, or you might go and see someone, but they're constantly communicating. And like I say, the structure of these messages is not like older people just writing a message and then getting a reply. It's this constant interaction, conversation.
It's like a web, isn't it, all the time?
Exactly. And being able to do this and manipulate language in that way. And of course, that kind of social media and kind of communication languages is sort of in between speaking and writing anyway. The two are less separate than they used to be, because your average sort of communication over social media is sort of written, spoken language, whereas it used to be very separate. So I think they're using language in really sophisticated ways. The problem, of course, is that other people argue, well, it's all very well them having all these slang words and different ways of saying stuff, but of course it's not going to get them a job, and they're going to, when they're in an interview, it's not going to come across very well. But like I say, the young people I work with, I'm yet to meet one who wasn't able to switch it around.
That's code switching.
I was just going to say that as well.
And they're not. It doesn't mean they're perfect, because nobody's perfect in an interview situation. I know I could improve. And then even just listen to the beginning of this podcast, and I bet I was very kind of hesitant and kind of stumbling over what. There's all sorts of. Everybody can improve, so they're not perfect, but they're certainly not being let down by their kind of inability to not speak slang. It's not like they're sitting there in an interview just speaking in slang and swearing. It's nothing like this. And
they absolutely understand the context as well, because my 15-year-old, I was having a conversation with her because I was telling her about who we were speaking to today, and we were talking about this whole issue of youth language, and she said, oh, it just really annoys me when people go on about that stuff, in a negative way, because she said, I know how to, it's just like anything. It's like when I go round to a friend's house and I speak to her mum, I know that I have to be polite and well behaved and maybe use language that I wouldn't necessarily use with my friend, or like I might swear in front of one person, but I wouldn't do it in front of a teacher. And it's no different with her social media language or her informal language with her friends. She all our children know
exactly
how to mix it up so that they're appropriate, just as we learned those things and just as our parents learnt those things.
Yeah.
Rob, can I ask you, do you think this the fact that there's historical evidence obviously that young people are always creating language and using it differently, do you think that's because young people are inherently curious and creative and try things in a different way, or do you think they're creating language to perhaps exclude older people or to create an identity for themselves? Is there a difference in how they approach it?
I think it's both of those things, and the reason why studying the language of young people is so interesting. Well, there's two big reasons. The first is, of course, we know language changes over time, but it doesn't tend to change within one generation. So once you become an adult, your language doesn't change hugely for the rest of your life. There's some change, but not hugely. So of course the changes are taking place between the generations. So that's one reason to look at the language of young people, because they're at the forefront of this change.
Yeah.
But the other reason is exactly as you say, that time of life is one where people are kind of working out who they are, and they're trying to kind of negotiate their new sort of adult identities. And one way in which they do that is through language. They do that through the way they dress, the way they behave, I don't know, kind of tattoos, how they have the hair, makeup, piercings, all of these things, the music they listen to, is all a way of performing different identities. But language plays a part in that, and it's a case of who aligns with who, and forming these social groups. And one of those huge social groups is as an adolescent as opposed to an adult. So they will be using language quite rightly, as I said before, quite rightly to exclude adults, to be part of a different group.
Give them their own space.
Exactly. And so that's how it should be. But so I think it is those two things. It's they are kind of the mechanism of language change anyway, quite naturally, but also they're using language in order to create their emerging identities.
Yeah.
That's a really nice, lovely celebratory way of thinking of it as well. And it's lovely to hear you talk about that as a linguist and celebrating that rather than so negatively,
Just sort of an extension of this sort of youth language talk, the conversation that we're having here is the effect of living in a more globalized world. Rob, do you see young people blurring US and UK English? I mean, have you got evidence of that? I certainly think I see that with my teenagers. And I just wondered if you're seeing that, if there's evidence to support that, or is it in written word as well as spoken? What are you seeing trend-wise there?
That's really tricky. I'll be honest. I don't really know what's going on. My instinct is actually that, as in terms of kind of globally and how English is used globally, I have a feeling that people might feel the need to assert their national identities more strongly in some ways. So language might be used. So even though more people are speaking English, but there'll be many more different varieties of English, because of course it's been a long time since English belonged to the UK. English really is a global language in the sense that it doesn't belong to anybody anymore. So people aren't learning English they're not even learning English to speak to so-called native English speakers. They're using English as that's the means of communication.
It's like the lingua franca, isn't it?
So and then there might be a sense that because there's this requirement, people are almost being forced from a kind of society perspective, forced to learn English, and they might want to disassociate themselves from the connotations, because it has a very dark past anyway,
Mm.
in terms of, with the history of England and the history of the United States. So it might be that people are using language and people are using their own varieties of English to reassert their national identities, even though they're using the same language. So I don't know, but
Yeah.
I agree with young people and the way that media is consumed and everything. For young people, there might be much more of emerging
Yeah.
different varieties. I'm not
Yeah.
sure.
It's interesting that you say that, because I work, a lot of my work is in English language teaching materials.
Right, yeah.
And I think the figure is something like 3 out of 5 English speakers are non-native speakers. It's not their first language. And I see this starting to be reflected in the textbooks and the student resources, that there, it is not one English that's being, promoted anymore. It's recognizing Arabic and Singlish
Yeah.
and all these sorts of things, because chances are that when these learners are speaking English, like you say, it's not going to be to a native speaker. It's going to
No.
be to another non-native speaker, and it's just the common language that they're using. But I think that whole point about holding on to your identity through the type of English you use is really interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's good to hear that that's the change in material as well, because that's being acknowledged in ELT materials. Because I started out as an EFL teacher.
Did you?
Yeah,
Right.
that's why I did that for a long time,
Uh-huh.
and I was very aware. I used to teach in Turkey. I was teaching Turkey for a few years, and I was very aware that to be fair, they were very old textbooks we were using,
Uh-huh.
but
Yeah.
they were still really they were teaching British culture as much as, and it just seemed
Yes.
so
Yes.
wrong. I thought these young people, they're not even, they'll probably never go to you. There's no reason for them to go to the UK, and that's not why they're learning English anyway. They were learning English because some of them are being kind of forced to, through their university or jobs or whatever.
Yeah.
And it just seemed kind of wrong that it was being packaged together, and that there was a very singular variety that they were being exposed to,
Yeah.
which seemed wrong.
That
Yeah.
is really interesting, actually, that point about how a language that is learned can be so infused with politics.
Oh, yeah.
I remember even, and culture, because I remember a friend of mine who identifies as British, but she has a German mother. And she told me once that when she speaks German, which she speaks fluently, she feels like a slightly different person. She feels, because the language is infused with
Yeah.
different cultural references, and it's slightly dislocating for her. So if she's speaking German if she's not in Germany, if she's in Germany, it feels like a comfortable switch. But if she starts speaking German over here, in the UK, it's a slightly different experience for her, as very, very intimately, and that sort of ties in with that whole sense of identity as well. But how that could be used really negatively, when you're sort of enforcing a language and a grammar on other people learning English when it's not their native language.
Yeah.
What's your view, Rob, on the internet and how that's impacted on, particularly on when we've talked about already about the role of the internet and social media more specifically, in terms of kind of the way it's a sort of hybrid spoken and written language. But what about how its role, the internet's role in pedantry and peevery?
I think social media and Twitter and Facebook are just a pedant's dream, to be honest. They're just
Pedant's paradise.
it really is. Yeah, pedant's paradise. It's just this kind of I mean, Twitter. I mean, I'm a big fan of Twitter, and I spend a lot of time on Twitter. I think it's great for kind of discussing language related things. But there's a real kind of nastiness as well, and I think it's very easy to criticize people, and this sort of idea of online shaming of grammar mistakes, and it really annoys me, and that the kind of the pride people take, and the fact that it's so easy to then have photos of badly worded shop signs and missing apostrophes.
Yeah.
For me, this is different to, say, if you have a big, a corporate shop sign and they're missing an apostrophe, and that's fine, that's one thing, and that should be pointed out, and that's, it's just, a mistake. But when people are putting up pictures of handwritten shop, there might be a handwritten sign in the window of a newsagent's, and somebody's criticizing their lack of, the dodgy apostrophes. And you think, well, this could be someone's second, third, fourth language, and
Exactly.
Yeah.
and it's an informal sign in a shop window. You know exactly what it means, and just because this person either hasn't had the education that the observer has, or hasn't, or was away the day that they taught the most ridiculous conventions of apostrophes, because they're not consistent. Whatever anyone says, the rules of the convention, they're not rules. The conventions around apostrophes aren't consistent, and so it's that kind of thing. I think that need to correct people, I found really kind of troubling, and I think
the snobbery that comes with it, that sense of being better than the next
well,
person.
that's it, because that's all you're doing. That's what you're doing, and it's that. And when when if someone might be making a really useful point on Twitter or something, they might be making I've seen tweets where somebody's said something really interesting or really profound or really moving about something, and then literally there'll be a reply somewhere just saying it's your, not your.
Oh, I know. Oh, it's so
really?
frustrating, isn't it?
I just don't
Right.
kind of.
Right, thanks for dragging the conversation away from the interesting bit.
Exactly. Although, to be fair, that you, by the same token, you have to, once you've taken this stand, you have to be consistent, and it's tempting when you then you'll see some nasty kind of racist, misogynist kind of, and they're mangling apostrophes, and you have to stop yourself then, because you kind of think, well, because then it just belittles the argument both ways. The point is, it's not a good thing to do anyway, because it just distracts. It either distracts from a very good point someone's made, or it distracts from some kind of
a very bad point.
Exactly.
I'm involved with the SFEP social media team, and so I'm involved in what goes on our Facebook page and our Twitter page and all that sort of thing. And we frequently get people messaging us with, like you say, pictures of signs with spelling errors or poor punctuation or whatever, and thought you might be interested in this, feel free to share it. And we never do it, because that is absolutely not our purpose, it's not our ethos, and it's that we're not about shaming people, but people misunderstand the role of the society, but it's a very common misunderstanding about editors as well.
The other awful thing about it is that it makes a lot of people afraid of grammar and afraid of language, afraid of using new language, or of sometimes going public, and it makes a lot of people afraid of writing, and therefore afraid of a really, really useful way of communicating. And that's horrible to think that that language and grammar in particular are being used as tools to exclude.
It is, I mean, I bet you get this. You'll probably get this more than me, but I've had people tell me they were afraid of emailing me or being concerned about either. They'll say, "Oh, yeah, I was worried about this email," or "I checked this email 3 times just to check this note." And I'm thinking, I might notice. I'm not going to say that's kind of what I do, but it wouldn't make me think.
You don't care.
No,
I don't care.
And you don't, and we don't judge people on that basis either. Because it's what a lot of editors will say when they're faced with somebody that says that is, well, we're coin operated, and we'll correct you when we're being paid, but otherwise we don't care. Rob, when you gave us your amazing talk at our conference this year, you put up that wonderful graph you have, you put it up on the screen, showing the relationship between knowledge and pedantry. Now, we know this is audio only, but give it a go. Can you tell us a little bit about what that was all about? Explain it so perhaps everyone who wasn't there can get a flavour of it, because I think it was incredibly useful and insightful.
It really was.
Well, thank you. Well, I'm very proud of this. I think because I'm proud of it, because it's from my own experience, from being an ex kind of pedant, and I realized that that's what a lot of people who work with language have also felt. So the idea was, there was just a graph where there were two lines on it, one about knowledge of language and one linguistic pedantry. And it tried to show that once there were kind of four key points in someone's life relating to language, and right at the beginning you learn a bit about language, you might learn a few rules, and then suddenly once you've done this, you then start to become a bit of a pedant, because you start to notice when people aren't abiding by those rules. So you might learn about less and fewer, and splitting infinitives and all these things, and then whom, when to use whom, and you think, okay, I'm quite clever now, and you'll notice when other people do, so you start to correct other people. But then what happens is you quite enjoy doing this. You enjoy correcting other people. You enjoy that sense of feeling a bit clever and a bit superior. So your pedantry goes right up. This gets reinforced, and you become a full-on pedant. But your knowledge of language hasn't actually increased, because you know the same as you did, but you have this confidence, this false confidence from the little bit of knowledge you have. So then that's the worst bit. You're a kind of full-on pedant, but you don't actually know that much about language. Then you decide to learn a bit more about language. So the knowledge about language line goes up. And at that point, the pedantry starts to come down, because you realize that isn't a very sensible thing to do. And that these rules that you'd learn, they're not rules, they're just conventions. And there's loads of exceptions. And it's all to do with context. And so the pedantry comes down, the knowledge of language goes up. And then eventually you learn lots about language, and you become completely the opposite, and you're completely anti-pedant, and you look back at all the pedants and think that's a bad place to be. And so at that point, I always say that's when you're kind of called upon to then challenge some of the pedants, which I spend a lot of time doing. But literally everyone I've spoken to who has, I think almost any anti-pedant started off as some sort of pedant.
You're absolutely right.
I think it's totally natural. I think you learn these things, and you do take a pride, but it's when you really learn them that you think, actually that doesn't make any sense. However, for the event that I saw you at, I actually added a tiny bit more to the and because again, it's just this is just my life, this is just my reflection, and it was a little kind of blip at the end where you become a sort of pedantic anti-pedant, and you're almost looking for examples of pedantry to then come along and say, no, you're wrong, you shouldn't be doing this. And I know I did that. I know I was doing that last year. I know I was almost scouring Twitter just so I could come in and say, you're wrong, you shouldn't be doing this. And to be honest, that's just as unattractive not as unattractive, but it's only a little blip in the graph.
I want to use a teenager's word. I want to say, I stand this so much.
Yes,
I really do.
That's good.
Because I'll tell you, Rob, this absolutely mirrors a blog post I wrote about 2 years ago.
Oh, right, okay.
Do you know what I mean, Louise? It's the one that's called The Grammar Police is Not Cool. And it basically details my journey through your graph.
Good. Oh, I'll have a look.
I'll send you a link to it. And I think it's an experience that so many, like you say, so many editors go through this, and it's almost like it's a rite of passage.
It is.
It is. And different people will be at different points on the graph, and I know that when I was talking to at that event, I knew there were some people that were further back along the graph. You just know, and maybe thinking, well, who's this guy coming in here telling us? And
they the ones booing and from the
So,
they're the one that gave you 1 out of 5 for your talk.
That's the one. And it's but also something that I sometimes, when I'm talking about the graph, I forget to emphasize that this is all about pedantry and not preferences, and I think that's really important. I think it's totally normal and totally natural for us, people who are interested in language, who work with language. We've all got preferences. And that's fine. There might be particular words you like. There might be particular grammatical structures you like, or even bits of punctuation you like. And for me, because I work a lot with accents, there are particular kind of accents I like, or sounds that I like. But the point is, everyone has their preferences, but it's only when those preferences become judgments that's the problem, and that's the difference.
Absolutely. That's a really good point to make.
Particularly for editors listening, because so much of our work is about respecting style and voice. Whether it's fiction or non-fiction, and you may like or you may not particularly gel with an author's style, but you have to protect it and respect it when you're
Sure,
editing.
yeah.
Rob, do you have any advice for any editors listening to this about how they should approach the issue of pedantry and peevery? I mean, you've touched on this actually already, because it is, I guess, one of the first things to do is that we need to recognise when we're being pedants or anti-pedants.
Yes. Well, it's difficult. I mean, and I think you're in a really interesting area, and because in some ways your job is to be pedantic in terms of, you know, your actual role. You're having to. I guess you tread a very fine line between what would be a descriptive approach to language and a prescriptive approach to language.
Yeah.
As in, you need to be aware of how language is changing, but you also your job will be to get this piece of writing into the kind of to match the style that is required of this particular publication, and that will involve abiding by these conventions, which which are contextually appropriate. But of course, in that context, it's absolutely right. In the same way that I always have this argument with people who, when they listen to me talking about this stuff, and they say, well, what about when you're marking student essays? Do you not worry about apostrophes? And well, of course I do, and I'm really quite strict on this, because I know the conventions, and I know that in this context it's very important, because that's how you'll be judged, and that's the criteria we're going against, rightly or wrongly. That's what we're doing. So I think, yeah, your kind of role is very interesting. But I imagine what you need to do is somehow you have to try and, well, like you sort of mentioned earlier about being kind of coin operated, you have to sort of compartmentalize your approach to language at work with your approach to language in the very messy linguistic reality of everyday life. And I guess it's having that division. But I think it's all. I mentioned in the talk, sort of becoming more kind of getting engaged with areas of language outside your comfort zone, which I think is quite an important thing to do. And so whether it's working with different forms of language, just to see, what else is out there. But I think the main thing for all of us is just to try not to be a pedant in real life. And I think it's all, because I think people who are quite pedantic, I think they think they're doing people a favor. I think they argue to themselves that they're trying to help somebody, that they think they're being kind, but you're almost always not. And it's the same way. It's sort of similar to, imagine if somebody came up to you to criticize or to correct the way you were dressed. Imagine somebody just out of the blue said, you really shouldn't be wearing those things together. And it might be somebody who knows a lot about fashion or is a real expert, but unless their opinion's been asked for, it's a little bit of, and I see it in the same way. So they might think they're doing you a favor, but you might not care, or you might not agree. And I think it's a similar thing to that. I think that idea that I think that's how people justify it. They're trying to, that they think, well, this person should know, and I think they'd like to know that whom isn't correct here, and it should be who. But unless they've asked for that, I don't think it's what we should be doing. But from what I could gather from the people I spoke to, who are editors, this is completely that's exactly what everyone does. It's that sort of compartmentalizing your two approaches to language, I think.
Yeah. I'm always immensely grateful when colleagues email me privately if they've noticed. Again, it's that contextual relevance. If say they've noticed something on a blog post or in one of my courses or a book or something, and they'll say, oh, look, and this is just a private thing, it's just a little heads up, and I'm always so grateful for that. What I hate and get really cross about is when someone does that in front of 10,000 people on social media or whatever.
Exactly.
That's unforgivable. Well,
exactly.
Maybe that's a little bit too over the
no, but that's it. Yeah, exactly. And then it's your job, and that would be a kind of a nice professional, way to do it. And I think that's absolutely fine. I think that's good. I mean, because also you've got to be, once you start correcting people, you've got to. It can be so sort of judgmental and so I don't know. what's the word? But when you something that gets me is when people are kind of made to look foolish for not knowing. Slightly different from writing, but not knowing how to pronounce a word
Yeah.
that they only know from reading.
Which is a
Yeah.
wonderful thing, because it shows they've been
Exactly.
reading.
I think
Yes.
it's such a good. It's something that people laugh at, but it's actually a really positive thing. It just and
Yeah.
so I think that's a strange one. So people want to know. People like when I was at university and I was doing American studies, did my first degree, and I remember giving a presentation about national parks in America, and I was talking about
I know what's coming.
I was talking about Yosemite National Park.
Oh, I
And
think I've made the same error.
Me too.
and I was
Yeah.
and I was and then but of course that's the sort of thing you want to be corrected. In that case, I
Yeah.
do want to be corrected, but obviously in a nice way, not to be ridiculed in front of the whole
Yeah.
class, which is what might have happened.
It is about being kind, isn't it? And
It
whether
is.
whether the advice has been solicited or not.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yes. Solicited, then of course, then you tell people exactly what they need to know if it's been asked for. Unsolicited, I think you've got to be really careful. And if you're trying to avoid somebody facing an embarrassing situation,
Yes. With its harm, potential
exactly,
harm.
then you can do it in a kind way, in a private
Yeah.
way, absolutely. But as soon as language is used to ridicule, because correcting, kind of criticizing people's language is always about more than something. It's always about something more than language. It's always about what. There's always an element of the kind of unsolicited criticism is always about, look, I'm just that bit cleverer than you, and
Yeah.
and I think that's what we need to avoid.
And it backfires as well, because I tend to take Denise and I have talked about this before, but sort of privately, but there's this issue of when one is publicly criticised or shamed publicly, that's just someone you're not going to engage with anymore. You're never going to refer work to them. You're not going to do work for them. You don't want to engage with people like that. We've talked about how we think that people need to remember that when you take that line, when you go down that path, and given how social media is so much about not just communication and sharing, but about relationships, as soon as you go down that line, you're potentially breaking and harming potential relationships, and you're just shooting yourself in the foot.
Yeah. Rob, thank you so much for taking time to talk to us today. I think we could probably discuss this with you for hours if our time allowed us.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure.
We've really enjoyed it. I think our listeners will get an awful lot from this conversation today. We'll make sure that we pop the links for your books and your website into the show notes, so that people can read a bit more about what you have to say on these topics.
No problem, that'd be great. And obviously the graph, we'll give you a link to the
Great, yes.
Thank you, yeah.
We have to share that widely with the world.
We have to. We need to spread the word.
Yes. So now it's time for Editing Bites. This is our regular feature where we recommend a tool or resource to help you on your writing journey. So Louise, what have you got for us this week?
So my bite this week is the Radical Copy Editor blog. Editor Alex Capitan uses that blog to educate anyone who uses words and wants to understand how words communicate values, norms, ideals, and how that means language isn't neutral, how it can be used to oppress and hurt, but also liberate and heal. And it's an absolutely brilliant blog. And what I really love about it is that it's utterly non-judgmental. I always learn a ton from Alex, and I recommend it to anyone who wants to learn how to think and write more inclusively.
That's fantastic, yeah. My bite this week is an interview that Joanna Penn did with Jane Freeman about Jane's book, The Business of Being a Writer. Joanna is a hugely successful indie author, and her website is just full of resources for writers. And Jane is a very experienced publishing professional. They discuss in this conversation how to be strategic in the business of being a writer, looking at multiple income streams, and how to use and get the most out of blogging and social media to promote your writing. It's definitely well worth a listen.
So that's it. We hope you've enjoyed this episode. Thanks so much for listening to the Editing Podcast. You can rate, review and subscribe to us via Apple Podcasts, Spotify or whichever platform you prefer.
And as I said before, we'll put all the links we've mentioned in the show notes so you can grab everything there. Bye.
Bye-bye.